Something important has shifted, even if you wouldn't yet call it a result. What matters is that you have crossed a quantum threshold. That crossing means your internal state has moved into a range where alignment with a higher timeline is no longer distant or theoretical. It is now active, responsive, and sensitive to how you hold yourself in the present moment. A quantum threshold is not the finish line. It is the point where effort stops being the primary driver and awareness becomes the deciding factor. Before this point, your vibration was too far from your higher timeline for subtle adjustments to matter. You could want it, think about it, work toward it, and still feel resistance. After this point, the resistance is no longer structural. The distance has collapsed. What remains is calibration. This is why this moment feels different. Not dramatic, not explosive, but charged in a quieter way. You may notice that small emotional shifts now have outsized effects. When you relax, things move. When you tense, friction appears immediately. This is not coincidence. This is how reality behaves once compatibility has been reached. The universe responds faster because you are no longer asking it to bridge a gap that no longer exists. This video is not here to create the shift for you. It is here to support a shift that is already happening. Crossing the threshold means you are in a transitional zone. Old patterns may still appear, but they no longer feel solid. Reactions may still arise, but they dissolve more quickly. You may feel moments of clarity followed by moments of uncertainty. This instability is not a sign that you are off track. It is a sign that the system is recalibrating. What matters now is not effort, discipline, or intensity. Those tools belong to an earlier phase. What matters now is how you relate to your emotional state and how present you remain with it. The universe does not move you into a higher timeline by force. It responds to coherence. Crossing the threshold means your baseline coherence is finally high enough that allowing accelerates the process instead of stalling it. This is also why control begins to fail here. Control introduces noise. It pulls you back into a frequency that assumes resistance is still required. Presence does the opposite. It stabilizes the signal. It allows the alignment to complete itself without interference. The tools in this video are not techniques to make something happen. They are ways to notice when you are aligned and when you are disrupting the process. You are not starting over. You are not behind. You are not waiting for permission. You are close enough now that what you do with your attention matters. That is what crossing the quantum threshold actually means. The universe did not decide your outcome. It recognized your readiness. The shift is happening. Your role is not to push it forward, but to stop pulling it backward. Click subscribe now to stay within this frequency. What separates one timeline from another is not what happens in them. It is the state from which they are perceived and sustained. Timelines are not sequences of events you move through. They are parallel states of identity coherence. Each one reflects a different internal configuration, and reality simply mirrors whichever configuration is dominant. This is where most confusion begins. People think timelines change when circumstances change. In truth, circumstances are the last thing to update. The real separation between timelines exists at the level of identity. How you relate to uncertainty. How you respond emotionally when nothing is resolved yet. How much internal resistance you carry while the present moment unfolds. These are not side details. They are the selectors. A quantum threshold marks the point where identity coherence becomes strong enough to override old momentum. Before that point, your internal state fluctuates too much for a new timeline to stabilize. You can want change, visualize it, take action toward it, and still remain anchored in the same experiential loop. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because coherence has not yet locked. The threshold is crossed when contradiction inside you drops below a certain level. When what you think, feel, and expect stop pulling in different directions. This does not require positivity. It requires consistency. Once that consistency is reached, reality is forced to reorganize. Not as a reward, but as a consequence. The field cannot maintain a structure that no longer matches the signal generating it. This is why desire does not move timelines. Desire points to a gap. It highlights distance. It reinforces the identity of someone not yet there. Action alone does not move timelines either. Action taken from misalignment only produces more evidence of effort and delay. Even visualization, when used as a technique, often strengthens separation by emphasizing what is missing. Timelines respond to being, not doing. They respond to the emotional baseline you return to when nothing is happening. They respond to how you interpret contrast, not how you escape it. When that baseline shifts, the timeline shifts with it, automatically. Crossing the quantum threshold means the internal signal has become clean enough that small adjustments now matter. You are no longer trying to overpower an incompatible reality. You are fine-tuning within a compatible range. This is why things can feel sensitive now. Minor resistance creates immediate friction. Minor relaxation creates noticeable flow. This sensitivity is not instability. It is responsiveness. The mistake many people make at this stage is trying to use old tools on a new operating system. They double down on effort, control, or constant intention setting. That behavior belonged to a phase where coherence was not yet established. After the threshold, it becomes noise. It introduces contradiction into a signal that was just stabilized. Understanding timelines this way removes the struggle narrative entirely. You are not climbing toward a better future. You are selecting between parallel states by how you hold yourself now. Every moment is a vote, not through thought, but through emotional consistency. Once this is seen clearly, urgency dissolves. There is nothing to chase. There is only coherence to maintain. Reality does not need convincing. It needs clarity. And clarity emerges when identity stops oscillating. This is the real separation between timelines. Not effort. Not luck. Not technique. Identity coherence. When that locks in, the rest follows without negotiation. When you crossed the quantum threshold, nothing exploded, and that's exactly why the shift is real. Major timeline crossings don't come with dramatic displays or loud signals. The shift is subtle, quiet, and internal because it isn't about an event, it's about stabilization. The fact that you feel calm, neutral, or even a bit disconnected from the external chaos is actually the strongest sign that things are falling into place. The mistake many people make is expecting a dramatic, aha moment, something that confirms their transformation has been validated by the universe. But timelines are not shaped by big moments of emotional intensity. They are shaped by identity coherence, and coherence moves quietly. This is why it feels like nothing is happening, even though everything is changing. When your vibration reaches the point where it is aligned with your higher timeline, it stabilizes. There's no need for upheaval, no need for a drastic emotional shift to indicate progress. Calm and neutrality are actually signs of alignment, not stagnation. If you feel emotionally settled, that's a clear indicator that you've passed the phase of resistance and conflict. Your emotional state has normalized, which means the internal shift has already taken place. This calmness is often mistaken for a lack of movement, but in fact, it's the opposite. The world around you will begin to reorganize, but it does so quietly. Reality doesn't need to shout to signal a change. It just adjusts to match the internal shift you've already made. The contrast you experience will now be about calibration, not crisis. It may feel like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something bigger to happen, but that's because the shift is happening internally first, not externally. The field is catching up to your new state of being. If you've been waiting for fireworks or some big, emotional moment to prove you've made the shift, it's important to understand that those signals are simply not how quantum shifts unfold. This shift is not a dramatic event, it's the result of consistent, internal alignment. The fact that you feel more grounded, more in control, or even just more at ease is the real signal of transformation. Transformation at this level is not about what happens externally. It's about the subtle reorganization of your energy, your emotions, and your internal state. The outer world will begin to shift in response to this change, but it does so with ease, not force. The most powerful shifts happen when there is no resistance, when you simply allow the new state to emerge naturally. So if you're not feeling the intense rush you expected, that's okay. It's actually a positive sign. True transformation often feels calm and neutral because it's a natural unfolding, not a manufactured event. The shift has already happened, and now it's about settling into this new state. Embrace the neutrality and calm. It's the sign that your alignment has been made, and the world is now adjusting accordingly. Nothing exploded because nothing needed to. You've already crossed the threshold, and your new timeline is unfolding quietly. This is how it's supposed to feel. The universe does not listen to your words, your plans, or your explanations. It listens to your emotional tone. Emotion is not a reaction to reality, and it is not a personality trait. Emotion is frequency. It is instruction. It is feedback. It is the only evidence the universe uses to determine what state you are occupying and which timeline you are compatible with. This is why emotion matters more than intention. You can say you want change while emotionally reinforcing the absence of it. You can visualize a future while emotionally anchored in resistance. In those cases, the universe follows the emotion, not the idea. Emotion reveals what state you are actually broadcasting, not what you hope to experience. Expansion and contraction are the two primary signals. Expansion feels like ease, openness, clarity, or calm. Contraction feels like tension, urgency, heaviness, or internal pressure. These signals are not rewards or punishments. They are navigation. Expansion tells you that your current state is aligned with the direction your timeline is moving. Contraction tells you that something in your approach, interpretation, or resistance is pulling you out of coherence. There is no moral judgment in this system. Contraction does not mean you are wrong or failing. It means you are momentarily out of alignment with the frequency that your higher timeline requires. Expansion does not mean you are better or more evolved. It means your internal state matches the direction of movement. That is all. Once you cross a quantum threshold, these signals become more precise. Emotion responds faster. The feedback loop tightens. You feel alignment immediately, and you feel resistance immediately. This is not because you became fragile. It is because the system is now responsive. You are no longer operating at a distance from your desired timeline. You are close enough that emotional tone makes a difference. This is also why trying to suppress or override emotion backfires. Emotion is not an obstacle to be controlled. It is information. When you try to force positivity or deny contraction, you distort the signal. The universe responds to what is present, not to what is performed. Honesty stabilizes. Performance destabilizes. Your emotional baseline is the data stream reality responds to continuously. Not peak moments. Not affirmations. Not moments of intensity. The baseline you return to when nothing is happening is what sets the trajectory. That baseline is what the universe mirrors back through timing, encounters, and opportunities. This is why emotional neutrality can be more powerful than excitement. Neutrality often indicates coherence. There is no inner argument. No pull in opposite directions. The signal is clean. From the universe's perspective, a calm, consistent signal is easier to organize around than an intense but unstable one. At this stage, your task is not to manufacture emotion, but to notice it. Expansion means continue. Contraction means soften, release control, or reinterpret. That's it. No drama. No story. No self-correction. If this explanation resonates and clarifies something you've been feeling, press the like button now to acknowledge that resonance. Emotion is the language the universe understands. When you stop arguing with it and start listening, alignment becomes practical, immediate, and unavoidable. Nothing changes until it is recognized. Not believed. Not repeated. Not forced into existence through effort. Recognition is the trigger that collapses probability into experience. Until something is recognized, it remains potential. Once it is recognized, it stabilizes. This is one of the most misunderstood mechanics of reality. People assume action is what causes movement. In truth, action only amplifies whatever state is already active. If the state is incoherent, action creates more resistance. If the state is coherent, very little action is required. Recognition is what determines which state you are operating from. Recognition is a shift in awareness, not a thought you convince yourself of. It is the moment your system stops questioning whether something is true and starts behaving as if it already is. That moment is quiet. There is no surge of emotion. There is no dramatic conclusion. There is simply a settling. The internal argument ends. When recognition happens, the timeline stabilizes because there is no longer internal contradiction. Before recognition, part of you is aligned and part of you is still monitoring, checking, or waiting for confirmation. That split keeps probability fluid. Recognition collapses that split. Awareness stops oscillating, and reality responds by locking in a consistent reflection. This is why effort often delays what recognition accelerates. Effort implies that something is not yet secure. It reinforces the identity of someone trying to make something happen. That identity introduces friction because it broadcasts instability. Reality mirrors that instability back as delay, obstacles, or partial results. Recognition does the opposite. It removes the need to push. It is not passive, but it is precise. It says, without words, this is already true enough for me to stop negotiating with it. That internal decision is what the universe responds to. This is also why recognition is not the same as belief. Belief can exist alongside doubt. Belief often requires reinforcement. Recognition does not. Recognition does not need to be repeated because it does not fade. Once something is recognized, the system reorganizes around it automatically. Affirmations and repetition try to force recognition through persistence. Sometimes they work, but only when they eventually produce genuine recognition. Until then, they are just noise layered on top of uncertainty. Reality responds when the noise stops. After crossing a quantum threshold, recognition becomes especially powerful. You are close enough to the timeline that awareness itself functions as the switch. Small recognitions create large effects. Small doubts create immediate resistance. This is why this phase feels sensitive. It is not fragile. It is responsive. The mistake here is trying to do more instead of seeing more clearly. The impulse to act usually comes from discomfort with uncertainty. Recognition dissolves that discomfort. It does not answer every question. It removes the need to ask them. Once recognition occurs, action becomes clean. It arises naturally, without strain. It feels obvious. It feels timed. That is because it is no longer compensating for doubt. It is expressing alignment. You do not create reality by trying harder. You create it by recognizing when alignment is already present and refusing to destabilize it. That is the trigger. Everything else follows. After a quantum threshold is crossed, reality does not wait for your permission to change. It begins rearranging on its own. Not dramatically, not symbolically, and not in ways that demand attention. The changes are practical, subtle, and often easy to overlook if you are expecting spectacle. The first thing that shifts is friction. Situations that once required constant effort begin to loosen. Conversations resolve with less resistance. Tasks take less energy. Delays shorten or disappear entirely. This does not happen because you tried harder or planned better. It happens because the internal signal no longer contradicts the direction things are moving. When resistance drops internally, it has nothing to mirror externally. Timing also begins to adjust. You may notice that things line up without excessive coordination. The right information arrives before you need it. Decisions feel easier to make because fewer options feel viable. This is not intuition becoming stronger. It is noise being removed. When the signal stabilizes, timing becomes cleaner. Obstacles dissolve in the same way. Not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. Problems that once felt immovable lose their emotional charge, and when the charge disappears, the structure holding them together collapses. Some obstacles resolve. Others simply stop mattering. Both outcomes are signs of reorganization. What's important to understand is that none of this is happening because you are controlling it. In fact, attempts to control usually interfere with the process. The rearrangement happens because reality is always reorganizing itself to match the dominant internal state. Once the threshold is crossed, the old configuration can no longer be maintained. This is why these changes can feel underwhelming. There is no announcement. No clear marker that says, this is the moment things shifted. Life just becomes easier to move through. Less reactive. Less dense. The absence of struggle is the indicator, not the presence of excitement. Many people miss this phase because they are looking for confirmation instead of noticing relief. They expect proof in the form of dramatic events. But reality does not prove alignment. It reflects it. And reflection happens quietly. Another important detail is that these rearrangements are not final outcomes. They are adjustments. The environment is testing coherence. It is responding to your state and watching whether it holds. This is why trying to force results now can create setbacks. Force reintroduces contradiction. Allowing keeps the signal clean. You may also notice that certain people, habits, or obligations naturally fall away. Not through conflict, but through lack of resonance. Interaction decreases. Interest fades. The system simplifies. This is not loss. It is efficiency. The field is reducing excess to support stability. At this stage, your role is observation, not management. Notice what becomes easier. Notice where effort is no longer required. Notice where resistance appears quickly when you try to push. These are all data points confirming that the rearrangement is already underway. You did not ask reality to change. You became coherent enough that it had to. And once that happens, the process does not need your help. It needs your cooperation. If you recognize these subtle shifts already happening around you, write, "I am ready," in the comments to consciously mark this recognition. Reality is reorganizing because it has no other option. Your job now is simply not to interrupt what alignment has already set in motion. Control stops working after a quantum threshold because it was never designed for this phase. Control is not a flaw in your character. It is a survival tool built for operating inside misalignment. When reality felt unpredictable, control created a sense of safety. When outcomes felt distant, control created the illusion of progress. That tool worked when coherence was low. It does not work once coherence increases. After a threshold crossing, the system you are operating in changes. Reality becomes responsive instead of resistant. Small internal shifts now produce noticeable external effects. Control, however, assumes resistance. It assumes that reality must be managed, pushed, or corrected. When you apply that assumption to a responsive system, you introduce friction where none was needed. This is why control begins to fail here. Not because you are doing it wrong, but because it no longer matches your identity state. Control broadcasts the signal of someone who does not trust alignment to hold on its own. That signal pulls you back toward a previous timeline where effort and defense were necessary. Notice how control feels now compared to before. It feels tight. Heavy. Immediately exhausting. That feedback is not punishment. It is information. Your system is telling you that you are trying to operate from an outdated identity. The emotional contraction you feel when you try to micromanage outcomes is the signal that the tool no longer fits. It's important to understand that letting go of control does not mean becoming passive. It means recognizing that your role has shifted. Before the threshold, action compensated for incoherence. After the threshold, action amplifies coherence. Control interferes because it reintroduces contradiction. It splits your attention between trusting the process and monitoring it. Control also locks attention into the past. It relies on old data, old patterns, old fears. When you control, you are referencing who you used to be to decide what to do next. That attachment anchors you to a previous identity state, even as your system is trying to move forward. This is why control feels urgent. Urgency is always a signal of misalignment. Alignment does not rush. It responds. When you are aligned, action arises naturally and feels timely. When you are controlling, action feels forced and premature. The failure of control is not a loss of power. It is a sign that power has changed form. Power at this level is not about directing outcomes. It is about maintaining internal consistency. The more consistent your emotional state, the less external management is required. If you try to keep controlling after this point, reality will push back gently at first. Plans won't stick. Efforts will scatter. Timing will feel off. This is not sabotage. It is correction. The system is guiding you away from a strategy that no longer serves you. The shift now is simple but not always easy. You move from controlling reality to cooperating with it. From forcing outcomes to responding to feedback. From managing every variable to trusting coherence to do the work. Control belonged to the old identity because it had to. You don't need to judge that version of yourself. You simply don't need to operate from it anymore. Allowing is often misunderstood because it has been softened into something vague or passive. In reality, allowing is a high-precision state. It is not giving up, stepping back, or waiting. It is exact emotional neutrality combined with full presence in the current moment. Nothing more. Nothing less. When you are allowing, you are not trying to change reality, and you are not resisting it either. You are holding a state that does not argue with what is happening. That lack of argument is not indifference. It is coherence. And coherence is the clearest instruction the field can receive. Force creates noise. Action taken from urgency introduces mixed signals. Even well-intended effort can distort the instruction if it is driven by tension or expectation. Allowing removes that distortion. It sends a clean signal because it does not contain contradiction. The field does not respond to movement. It responds to clarity. This is why allowing works more efficiently than action at this stage. After a quantum threshold is crossed, the system becomes sensitive. The margin for error shrinks. Small emotional shifts now carry weight. When you push, you add pressure to a system that no longer requires it. When you allow, you stabilize the signal that is already active. Allowing does not mean doing nothing. It means acting only when action arises naturally, without internal pressure. The difference is subtle but critical. Action from allowing feels obvious and timely. Action from force feels rushed, defensive, or compensatory. The field mirrors that difference immediately. Emotional neutrality is the core of allowing. Neutrality does not mean suppressing feeling. It means not amplifying it with story. When emotion passes through without resistance, it resolves quickly. When emotion is judged, controlled, or dramatized, it lingers and distorts the signal. Present moment attention is the second component. Allowing cannot happen in the future or the past. Planning ahead introduces anticipation. Replaying the past introduces justification. Both pull you out of alignment. Allowing anchors awareness in now, where no correction is needed. From the field's perspective, allowing is precision because it removes excess instruction. There is no demand, no timing pressure, no preferred outcome. That absence gives reality room to reorganize in the most efficient way. Force narrows options. Allowing expands them. This is also why allowing can feel uncomfortable at first. Control gave the illusion of safety. Allowing removes that illusion and replaces it with responsiveness. You are not steering every moment, but you are not drifting either. You are listening. Adjusting. Staying coherent. At this level, doing less internally produces more externally. Not because you are disengaged, but because the signal is no longer scrambled. The universe does not need motivation. It needs alignment. Allowing provides it cleanly. When you notice yourself trying to manage outcomes, that is your cue to soften. When you feel pressure to decide immediately, pause. Allowing is not slow. It is accurate. It waits only as long as needed for the signal to be clear. This is why allowing outperforms force after the threshold. It is not passive. It is precise. After a quantum threshold is crossed, contrast no longer means what it used to mean. Challenges do not indicate failure, backsliding, or loss of alignment. They change function. What once acted as a barrier now operates as refinement. What once blocked movement now calibrates it. Before the threshold, contrast was corrective. It showed you where misalignment existed because coherence was not yet stable. Resistance meant something needed to change at a fundamental level. After the threshold, coherence is already present. Contrast no longer asks you to fix yourself. It asks you to fine-tune. This is an important shift to understand, because many people misinterpret contrast at this stage and unnecessarily destabilize themselves. A challenge appears, and the mind immediately assumes something has gone wrong. That assumption pulls identity backward. The resistance that follows is not caused by the challenge itself, but by the meaning assigned to it. Contrast now functions like calibration in a sensitive system. Small variations expose where attention drifts, where emotion tightens, where old reflexes briefly resurface. This is not punishment. It is feedback. The system is showing you exactly where coherence can be restored with minimal adjustment. Resistance only appears when identity briefly reverts. It shows up when you interpret contrast through an old lens. When you assume effort is required again. When you try to control, defend, or rush resolution. The moment you do that, contraction appears. Not because the contrast was wrong, but because the identity responding to it was outdated. If you stay present, contrast passes quickly. It does not escalate. It does not compound. It simply highlights, then dissolves. This is one of the clearest signs that you are operating from a new baseline. Old patterns no longer hook you for long. Emotional reactions still arise, but they don't harden into stories. The role of contrast now is refinement, not correction. It sharpens clarity. It reveals where alignment can be held more consistently. Think of it as tuning rather than fixing. The instrument already works. You are just adjusting its sensitivity. This is also why contrast may feel lighter but more frequent. The system is responsive. It doesn't wait for breakdowns to communicate. It signals early. That early signal is a privilege, not a problem. It allows you to recalibrate without drama. When you meet contrast with neutrality instead of resistance, it resolves almost immediately. When you meet it with curiosity instead of judgment, it becomes informative. When you meet it with presence instead of control, it does its job and disappears. The mistake is assuming contrast means you need to do more. Usually it means you need to do less internally. Soften the interpretation. Release the urge to react. Return to coherence. That's enough. After the threshold, contrast is no longer the enemy. It is a precision tool. It keeps alignment sharp, responsive, and stable. When you understand that, challenges stop feeling like setbacks and start functioning as quiet confirmations that the system is working exactly as it should. Timelines do not respond to desire. Desire does not move reality, select outcomes, or open access to different futures. Desire is informational. It tells you what you are not currently aligned with. That is its only function. When desire is mistaken for a creative force, it keeps people locked in the very separation they are trying to escape. Wanting highlights a gap. It reinforces the identity of someone who does not yet have, does not yet be, does not yet belong. That identity cannot access the timeline it is pointing toward, because timelines are not entered through longing. They are entered through coherence. Reality mirrors who you are being, not what you are hoping for. This is why desire can feel intense and still produce no movement. Intensity does not equal alignment. You can want something deeply while emotionally broadcasting resistance, urgency, or lack. The universe responds to the emotional baseline beneath the desire, not the desire itself. If that baseline says not yet, reality agrees. Desire becomes useful only when it is reinterpreted correctly. It is a directional signal, not an engine. It shows you which identity state you are incompatible with. It does not bridge the gap. Trying to use desire as fuel only strengthens the gap by constantly reminding you that you are not there. Timelines are accessed through identity coherence. That means how consistently your emotional state, expectations, and self-concept align with a particular way of experiencing reality. When that coherence stabilizes, the timeline becomes available automatically. No wanting required. No convincing necessary. This is why people often stumble into higher timelines accidentally, during moments when they stop wanting altogether. They relax. They let go. They stop trying to make something happen. In that moment, identity coherence briefly appears, and reality responds. When they later try to recreate it through desire, it fails, because the identity has changed back. After a quantum threshold is crossed, this distinction becomes critical. Desire now creates immediate friction. Wanting introduces urgency. Urgency destabilizes coherence. The more you want, the more resistance you feel, because the system is now sensitive enough to register the contradiction instantly. This does not mean you should suppress desire. Suppression creates tension. It means you should see desire clearly for what it is. Information. A pointer. Not a tool. Once you receive the information, you return to coherence. You do not chase the pointer. Identity coherence is quiet. It feels settled. It does not rush. It does not need to remind itself what it wants. It simply operates from a stable emotional baseline. That baseline is what the universe mirrors back as experience. When coherence is present, desire often dissolves on its own. Not because the outcome arrived, but because the identity that needed to want it no longer exists. At that point, the timeline shifts without ceremony. This is the core principle. Timelines do not respond to desire because desire belongs to misalignment. They respond to coherence because coherence belongs to identity. When identity stabilizes, the rest follows automatically. The highest timeline is not the most dramatic one, the fastest one, or the one that proves something to anyone. It is the one that requires the least internal resistance to maintain. This is where most people get confused, because they have been taught to measure growth through struggle. In reality, struggle is not a sign of elevation. It is a sign of friction. Internal friction is the only reliable metric. Friction shows up as tension, urgency, constant self-correction, or the feeling that you have to hold everything together through effort. When friction is high, you are not on a higher timeline, no matter how impressive it looks from the outside. You are compensating for misalignment. The highest timeline feels calmer, not more intense. It feels quieter, not louder. There is less internal negotiation. Fewer arguments with the present moment. Decisions require less justification. This does not mean nothing happens. It means what happens no longer requires resistance to sustain it. Ease is often misunderstood as laziness or avoidance. In reality, ease is efficiency. When identity coherence is high, energy is not wasted fighting reality. Movement happens with less drag. Progress feels natural because it is not being forced against the current of your own state. Calm is another misunderstood signal. Calm does not mean you lack ambition or clarity. It means your nervous system is no longer treating life as a problem to solve. When calm is present, attention sharpens. Perception widens. You respond instead of react. That responsiveness is what allows higher timelines to function smoothly. The belief that growth must be hard comes from earlier phases of development. When coherence is low, effort is necessary to counterbalance instability. Struggle feels productive because without it, nothing moves. But once a quantum threshold is crossed, that logic reverses. Struggle now creates noise. It pulls you out of alignment instead of proving commitment. This is why people sometimes sabotage themselves when things start working. Ease feels suspicious. Calm feels undeserved. The old identity associates effort with worth. When effort disappears, the mind looks for something to fix. That search reintroduces resistance. The highest timeline does not reward endurance. It rewards consistency. Consistency of emotional tone. Consistency of presence. Consistency of identity. When those stabilize, there is no need to push. The system supports itself. This does not mean challenges disappear. It means challenges no longer require internal collapse. They arise, are addressed, and pass without hijacking your state. There is no drama tax. No recovery period. That is a clear indicator of reduced friction. If you find yourself forcing motivation, forcing discipline, or forcing optimism, that is information. Something is being pushed upstream. Alignment does not require force. It requires honesty and adjustment. The question is not how much you can handle. The question is how little resistance you need to function well. The timeline that allows you to move with clarity, steadiness, and minimal internal conflict is the highest one available to you. When you stop equating struggle with growth, you stop choosing timelines that exhaust you. Ease is not the reward at the end. It is the sign you are aligned now. Creation does not happen in the past or the future. It cannot occur in memory, and it cannot occur in anticipation. Both of those are informational states, not creative ones. Memory reviews what already happened. Anticipation imagines what might happen. Neither of them selects a timeline. Only the present moment does. This is because identity only exists now. Identity is not who you were and not who you hope to become. It is the state you are embodying in this moment. Timelines respond to that state alone. When attention leaves the present, identity becomes unstable, and selection becomes impossible. The past feels convincing because it carries emotional weight. The future feels compelling because it carries expectation. But neither has causal power. They only influence reality when they pull your emotional state out of coherence in the present. When that happens, the timeline selection pauses. The signal becomes inconsistent. Presence is not a practice. It is a return. A return to what is already happening before interpretation, before projection, before correction. When you return to now, identity stabilizes automatically. There is no effort involved because there is nothing to manage. You are simply no longer divided. This is why presence is the only selection mechanism. In the present moment, there is no gap between who you are and what you are experiencing. That gap is what creates resistance. When the gap closes, coherence locks in, and the timeline becomes fixed. Trying to create from anticipation introduces urgency. Urgency assumes absence. It reinforces the identity of someone not yet there. Trying to create from memory introduces caution or regret. Both pull attention out of now and destabilize the signal. Reality responds by slowing, fragmenting, or stalling. Returning to the present moment stabilizes reality because it stabilizes you. Not emotionally elevated. Not artificially calm. Simply present. When attention rests here, the nervous system relaxes. The emotional baseline evens out. The internal argument ends. That alone is enough to hold alignment. This is also why techniques eventually stop working. Techniques are attempts to reach a different moment than the one you are in. They are useful when coherence is low. After a threshold is crossed, they become distractions. Presence does what no technique can because it removes the need to manipulate state. You don't select a timeline by thinking about it. You select it by how you inhabit this moment. How you breathe when nothing is happening. How you relate to uncertainty when there is no immediate answer. How quickly you return to neutrality after reaction. These are present moment behaviors, not mental strategies. Every time you come back to now, you vote for coherence. Not through effort, but through consistency. The more often you return, the less effort it takes. Eventually, presence becomes the default state, and the timeline stabilizes on its own. Nothing needs to be added to this moment for it to work. Nothing needs to be improved. The present moment already contains the correct instruction. When you stop leaving it, reality stops wavering. This is not something you do once. It is something you stop undoing. Presence holds the timeline because it holds identity. And identity, when stable, does the rest without assistance. Emotional triggers lose their authority once identity coherence stabilizes. They do not disappear because you suppress them or rise above them. They weaken because the state that required them is no longer active. Triggers exist to signal unresolved lessons. When the lesson is complete, the signal has no function. This is why the change feels natural rather than forced. You may notice that situations which once produced immediate reactions now barely register. The stimulus appears, but the emotional charge is gone. This is not numbness. It is integration. The nervous system no longer needs to react because it no longer perceives threat or lack. Desensitization at this level is often misunderstood. It is not bypassing emotion or avoiding depth. It is the result of having fully experienced, processed, and released a pattern. Bypassing avoids feeling. Integration completes it. Once completed, there is nothing left to trigger. Triggers are tied to identity. They form when an emotional response becomes part of how you navigate reality. After a quantum threshold, identity coherence increases, and those responses stop being useful. The system updates. What once protected you now restricts you. When that happens, the reaction dissolves on its own. This is why trying to heal triggers through effort often backfires. Effort assumes the trigger still has authority. It reinforces the identity that believes something is unresolved. After coherence stabilizes, the fastest way for triggers to dissolve is not attention, but neutrality. They fade when they are no longer fed. You may still notice the outline of old reactions. A brief impulse. A fleeting sensation. But it does not escalate. It does not hijack attention. It passes quickly. That is a clear sign that the lesson has been integrated. The memory remains, but the emotional charge does not. This process does not require revisiting the past. The past has already done its work. Integration happens in the present moment, through consistent alignment. Each time you respond instead of react, the nervous system learns that the environment is different now. Over time, it stops preparing for threats that no longer exist. It's important not to mistake this for avoidance. Avoidance is tense. Integration is relaxed. Avoidance suppresses. Integration releases. You can tell the difference by how it feels in the body. When a trigger dissolves through integration, there is no effort involved. There is relief. Another sign of integration is emotional proportionality. Responses become appropriate to the moment rather than exaggerated by history. You feel what is happening now, not what happened before. That is emotional maturity, not detachment. Triggers dissolve when lessons are complete because lessons are not intellectual. They are experiential. Once the system learns what it needed to learn, it moves on. It does not revisit resolved material. It does not keep old alarms active. This is one of the clearest indicators that a new baseline has been reached. You are no longer managed by reactions. You are informed by experience without being controlled by it. Emotional authority shifts from the past to the present. When this happens, you don't feel proud. You feel normal. Calm. Unburdened. That is how you know it's real. Once coherence stabilizes, effort becomes unnecessary. Not because nothing happens, but because attraction replaces pursuit. Magnetism takes over naturally when the internal signal is consistent. Reality no longer needs to be chased, managed, or convinced. It responds on its own. Effort was useful when alignment was unstable. It compensated for internal contradiction. It created motion where coherence was missing. But once coherence locks in, effort becomes interference. It signals that something is not trusted to arrive on its own. That signal weakens magnetism immediately. Magnetism works because it is passive in the right way. It does not pull. It does not reach. It holds. When your emotional baseline is stable, the field recognizes the signal as complete. From that state, experiences, opportunities, and connections move toward you without friction. Pursuit, on the other hand, always signals misalignment. It implies lack. It reinforces the identity of someone who must go out and get something. That identity cannot attract what it is chasing because it is broadcasting separation. The more intense the pursuit, the stronger the signal of absence. This is why things often arrive when you stop trying. Not because you gave up, but because the internal argument ended. The moment you stop negotiating with reality, the signal cleans up. Magnetism activates because there is nothing contradicting it. Resonance is the only requirement for arrival. When something resonates with your identity state, it does not need effort to enter your experience. It fits. It aligns. It flows in naturally. When something does not resonate, no amount of effort will make it sustainable. It will require constant maintenance and force. At this stage, you may notice that fewer things demand your attention. Your field becomes selective. You are no longer drawn to everything. This is not limitation. It is precision. Magnetism works best when the signal is clear, not scattered. You may also notice that people, ideas, or opportunities appear without obvious cause. This is not coincidence. It is alignment expressing itself. The field organizes around stable signals efficiently. When the signal stops changing, the response speeds up. This does not mean you never act. It means action arises from resonance instead of urgency. You move when it feels obvious. You stop when it feels complete. There is no push. No hesitation. That clarity is the result of coherence, not discipline. Effort-based systems rely on constant reinforcement. Magnetism does not. Once active, it sustains itself. That is why life feels lighter here. You are no longer carrying momentum forward manually. The system carries it for you. Trying to return to effort after this point creates immediate friction. Things stall. Timing feels off. Motivation drops. That feedback is not failure. It is guidance. The system is signaling that you are reverting to an outdated strategy. Magnetism replaces effort entirely because it is more efficient, more accurate, and more sustainable. When you stop trying to make things happen and focus on maintaining coherence, reality does the rest. Arrival is not something you force. It is something that happens when resonance is stable. Once that is in place, pursuit becomes unnecessary, and effort quietly exits the process. As coherence stabilizes, something counterintuitive happens. Speed increases, but noise decreases. Things move faster, yet there are fewer signs, fewer dramatic confirmations, and fewer moments that demand your attention. This often confuses people, because they have been conditioned to associate progress with intensity and validation. Earlier phases are loud because alignment is unstable. Reality has to exaggerate feedback to get your attention. Signs repeat. Patterns feel dramatic. Synchronicities announce themselves. That noise is not a reward. It is compensation. The system is amplifying signals because coherence is still forming. Once coherence stabilizes, amplification is no longer necessary. The signal is clear. Reality does not need to shout. It responds efficiently. Timing tightens. Responses shorten. Outcomes arrive with less buildup. The absence of spectacle is not a lack of movement. It is proof that the system no longer needs correction. This is why confirmations become quieter. You stop needing constant reassurance because identity no longer wavers. When identity is stable, you don't look for signs. You recognize alignment through ease, not symbolism. The need for external validation drops because internal consistency is doing the work. Reduced need for signs is not disinterest or disengagement. It is trust. Not blind trust, but structural trust. The kind that comes from seeing that things respond predictably when you stay coherent. You no longer scan reality for proof because you understand the mechanism. Presence replaces checking. Speed increases because there is less interference. Fewer internal debates. Fewer emotional reversals. Less second-guessing. When those fall away, momentum doesn't need to be rebuilt over and over. It continues uninterrupted. What used to take months of effort now resolves in days or moments, often without conscious planning. This silent speed can feel unsettling at first. The mind expects effort to be proportional to outcome. When outcomes arrive without struggle, the mind looks for what it missed. That search reintroduces noise. The key is recognizing that nothing is missing. This is what stabilization feels like. Stagnation feels heavy. Silent speed feels light. In stagnation, nothing moves and tension accumulates. In stabilization, things move smoothly and attention stays free. The difference is internal. If you feel calm while things progress, you are not stuck. You are aligned. Another sign of silent speed is reduced emotional volatility. Highs and lows flatten into steadiness. This does not mean less engagement. It means engagement without overreaction. You respond to what happens instead of riding emotional spikes. That steadiness allows reality to move faster without destabilizing you. When you understand this phase, you stop chasing confirmation. You stop asking whether things are working. You notice instead how little effort is required to stay on track. That is the confirmation. Speed with noise belongs to correction phases. Speed without noise belongs to coherence. If things feel quieter but continue to resolve, align, and unfold with minimal friction, you are not slowing down. You are operating efficiently. Stability does not announce itself. It demonstrates itself through consistency. When movement becomes subtle and reliable, you have not lost momentum. You have stopped interfering with it. You are not inside the universe, and the universe is not something happening around you. That assumption creates the illusion of separation, effort, and influence. When you believe you are a subject inside an external world, you try to change that world from the outside. That model is incorrect. Experience does not happen to you. It happens through you. You are not observing reality from a distance. You are the field through which reality organizes itself. What you call the universe is not an object you interact with. It is the visible pattern formed by your state of consciousness. This is why trying to influence reality never works the way people expect. Influence assumes separation. It assumes there is something out there that needs to be convinced, altered, or persuaded. That assumption immediately creates resistance, because it splits identity from experience. The moment you stop trying to influence, coherence returns. When identity stabilizes, experience reorganizes automatically, not because you changed the universe, but because the universe is responding to a different organizing principle. That principle is you. Not the personality. Not the thoughts. The state of awareness you are inhabiting now. This dissolves the idea of manifestation as control. You are not sending instructions outward. You are not pulling outcomes inward. You are not bending reality. Reality is continuously forming as an expression of the field you are occupying. Change the field, and the pattern changes. No effort required. Seeing yourself as the field removes urgency. There is nothing to fix externally. There is nothing to chase. There is nothing to influence. All movement happens through alignment, not intervention. When alignment is present, reality adjusts because it has no alternative. This is also why observation matters more than action at this level. When you observe without interference, the field stabilizes. When you react, you introduce distortion. The universe does not respond to your reactions. It reflects your state. Once this is understood, the language of inside and outside collapses. There is no inner world trying to reach an outer one. There is one continuous process expressing itself in different forms. Identity is the organizing center of that process. You are not small inside something vast. You are the vastness appearing as a localized perspective. From that position, effort becomes unnecessary. Control becomes irrelevant. Influence becomes obsolete. Coherence becomes everything. This does not make you powerful in a dramatic sense. It makes you precise. When the field is clear, the expression is clean. When the field is distorted, the expression fragments. Nothing else is required to explain what happens. The need to make things happen disappears because nothing was ever separate enough to be manipulated. Experience follows identity automatically. When identity stabilizes, reality stabilizes with it. This realization is not philosophical. It is practical. It explains why alignment works and control fails. Why effort creates friction and presence creates flow. You were never inside the universe trying to shape it. You were always the field through which it was taking shape. When that is recognized, the entire process simplifies. Nothing needs to be forced. Nothing needs to be reached. The universe is not responding to you. It is expressing you. Nothing was achieved in this process. That is the final and most important clarification. There was no level unlocked, no power gained, no version of you earned through effort. What happened was recognition. Something that was always present came back into view, and once it was seen clearly, the need to seek it ended. Progress implies distance. It assumes you were somewhere wrong and needed to arrive somewhere right. That assumption quietly powered the entire seeking loop. You were always moving towards something that appeared just out of reach, reinforcing the identity of someone not yet complete. Recognition collapses that structure instantly. There is nothing left to move toward. What you recognized was not a new ability, but a different orientation. You saw that alignment was never created through effort. It was obscured by interference. When interference dropped, coherence revealed itself. Nothing new entered the system. Something unnecessary exited it. This is why the journey feels strange when viewed in reverse. You did practices, learned concepts, adjusted behaviors, and refined awareness, yet the final realization says none of that created the shift. Those steps were not wrong. They were transitional. They brought you to the point where recognition could occur, and then they became irrelevant. No power was gained because power was never absent. What changed was permission. You stopped withholding it from yourself. You stopped assuming you needed to become something else to be aligned. In that moment, effort dissolved because it had no function left. This ends the seeking loop permanently, not because you reached the end, but because you saw the structure of the loop itself. Seeking was driven by the belief that alignment was missing. Once that belief dissolved, seeking lost its fuel. You may still explore, learn, and refine, but it no longer comes from lack. It comes from clarity. This is also why there is no excitement here. Excitement belongs to acquisition. Recognition brings calm. The system relaxes because it is no longer trying to get somewhere. The nervous system no longer scans for the next step. There is nothing to chase. You may notice that questions stop forming the way they used to. Not because everything is answered, but because the need for answers has softened. Curiosity remains, but urgency disappears. That is a clear sign the loop has ended. Nothing was achieved because nothing needed to be added. What was removed was distortion. What was remembered was your natural state of coherence. When that state is active, reality responds automatically, without negotiation or effort. This does not make you special. It makes you clear. And clarity is enough. From here, life continues, but it does so without the underlying tension of becoming. You are no longer trying to arrive. You are simply allowing experience to unfold through a stable identity. That is not an ending. It is the removal of a false beginning. Remaining aligned does not require maintenance. It does not require vigilance, repetition, or constant self-monitoring. Alignment sustains itself when you stop interfering with it. Presence alone is enough, because presence is the state where identity stays coherent without effort. The moment you turn alignment into something you have to hold, protect, or manage, you reintroduce tension. That tension pulls attention out of the present moment and back into control. Remaining is simpler than that. It is not an action. It is the absence of unnecessary correction. Presence is not something you do occasionally. It is what naturally happens when you stop leaving the moment you are in. You don't maintain presence. You return to it whenever attention drifts. That return does not require discipline. It requires noticing. And noticing is effortless. This is how alignment integrates into lived awareness. Not as a practice you remember to perform, but as a default state you come back to again and again. Over time, the return becomes automatic. The nervous system learns that nothing is wrong now. When nothing is wrong, there is nothing to fix. There is no need to watch yourself closely. There is no need to check whether you are aligned. Those behaviors belong to earlier phases where instability required monitoring. Here, monitoring creates instability. Presence stabilizes because it removes the observer that tries to manage experience. Life will continue to move. Challenges will appear. Decisions will still be made. The difference is internal. You are no longer bracing against what is happening. You meet experience as it arises and let it pass when it completes. That is what remaining looks like. You will know you are remaining not by how focused you feel, but by how little effort it takes to stay grounded. When alignment is stable, you don't think about it. You live from it. Attention rests naturally in the body, in the moment, in what is actually happening instead of what should be happening. This is not a fragile state. It does not need protection. In fact, trying to protect it weakens it. Alignment holds when you trust it to hold. The moment you try to secure it, you imply that it can be lost. Presence does not operate from that assumption. If attention drifts, you return. If emotion rises, you allow it to pass. If uncertainty appears, you stay with it without rushing resolution. These are not techniques. They are natural responses when identity is no longer divided. Remaining without effort means letting alignment be ordinary. Not special. Not intense. Not something you talk yourself into. Just the quiet baseline you operate from. From there, reality continues to reorganize, not because you are doing anything, but because coherence is uninterrupted. This is the integration. No final step. No vigilance. No maintaining a state. Just staying where you already are. If this clarity is something you want to remain connected to, subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it.